My name is Aaron. I have been a rabbi for over 30 years, born and raised within the tenets of Orthodox Judaism in Jerusalem. I have dedicated my entire life to the study of the Torah, to the commentaries of the Talmud, to the preservation of traditions, and to guiding my community. I have always been a rational, disciplined, and respected man, with an almost unchanging routine: intense study in the morning, counseling in the afternoon, rigorous prayers at the proper times, and absolute silence on Shabbat. On that Friday, everything was proceeding normally. My wife was preparing the challah, the grandchildren were running around the house, and I was reviewing the sermon I would deliver that evening. No premonition, no anomaly. I was calm, serene, as I always am on the eve of the sacred rest. It was in the late afternoon, around 5 o'clock, that everything began to go off course. I was sitting at the table, reading a passage from the prophet Isaiah, when I felt a strong pressure on my chest. I thought it was just a bad digestion or some accumulated fatigue, but the pain increased rapidly, radiating to my left arm and climbing up my neck. I tried to get up, but my legs simply failed me. I fell sideways onto the living room floor, still conscious, seeing the despair in my wife's eyes. She shouted for my children who were in the kitchen, and soon someone called for help. I heard everything, but my vision was already starting to darken at the edges. I didn't think about dying. I only thought that it was something that would pass, a trial perhaps. But then, suddenly, the sound began to recede as if I were sinking in water, and the last thing I heard was the distant siren, echoing as if I were inside a tunnel. When I opened my eyes again, something was deeply wrong. I was standing, or at least that was the sensation, but my body was still on the floor, surrounded by paramedics. 2 of them were taking turns performing cardiac massage, while the third prepared something that looked like a syringe. My wife was crying, clinging to my tallit, and my children were shouting my name. It made no sense. I was there, seeing everything, hearing everything, but I felt no pain, no fear, no confusion. I felt an absurd, almost offensive peace, as if I had forgotten what suffering was. Time seemed to slow down, and every detail caught my attention. The muffled sound of hands clapping on my chest, the sweat dripping from the forehead of one of the rescuers, the faint smell of wine and freshly baked bread in the air. It was like watching my own death, but without the despair I would have imagined for such a moment. Soon I realized that I was not exactly there. The environment around me seemed enveloped by a translucent layer, as if I were seeing everything through a dense yet crystalline veil. And then I felt something different, a kind of calling. It was not a sound, nor a voice per se, but an irresistible impulse coming from a specific direction. When I turned, I saw a light, but it was not an ordinary light. It did not hurt the eyes, did not come from a fixed point, had no shadow. It was alive, intense and gentle at the same time, as if it were breathing. I began moving toward it, although my feet did not touch the ground. Each step seemed to lift a weight from my chest, as if something old and hard were being ripped from me. I tried to look back, but I could no longer see the previous surroundings clearly. Everything around me was now enveloped by a presence so strong and indescribably loving that I could only move forward, feeling that something far beyond my understanding was about to happen. The closer I got to that light, the more the feeling of peace intensified, but along with it, something inside me began to tremble. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was as if everything I had always believed in was being put to the test, layer by layer. I, who had always been proud of the firmness of my faith, of the clarity of tradition, began to feel that there was something I had never fully understood. It was not ignorance, it was omission. And then, within the light, a figure appeared. I do not have enough words to describe what I saw, and no earthly image would do it justice. He was not just a man. He was living glory. He did not wear a crown, nor sit on thrones, nor bear symbols of power as we imagine, but he carried an authority that penetrated straight into the soul. His eyes were like fire and mercy at the same time. When he looked at me, I knew, before any word was spoken, who he was, and that is when the true conflict within me began. Everything in me wanted to recoil, to deny, to resist. I was a Jew. I was a rabbi. I had taught my entire life that that man, Jesus, was a distortion, a historical mistake, a figure misunderstood by other traditions. How could I accept that he was there, before me, in that impossible light, with that peace that transcended everything, I felt small, naked, exposed. It was as if, with just his gaze, all my arguments had dissolved. But he did not accuse me. He did not pressure me. He simply waited. His presence was so intense that I began to cry, not from fear, but from recognition. I knew somehow that it did not come from logic, that this was the Messiah, the same one that the scriptures pointed to, the same one I had studied without truly seeing, that I had quoted so many times in the Psalms, in the prophecies of Isaiah, and that was now there before me. He did not need to say, "It is I." My heart already knew. Then he began to show me, not with words, nor with gestures, but as if my mind were being opened and the scriptures were coming to life right there, before me. I saw Mount Moriah. I saw Abraham and Isaac. But this time, I saw the lamb caught among the bushes, not as any ordinary animal, but as a foreshadowing. I understood, in an almost painful way, that this was not just a story about faith and obedience, but a prefiguration of a much greater sacrifice. Then I saw Moses lifting up the bronze serpent in the desert, something I had always considered a strange, even uncomfortable episode. But there, in that moment, I perceived the parallel with someone being raised for healing and salvation. Everything made sense in a brutally clear way. The pieces fit perfectly, and it emptied me from within. Not because what I believed was false, but because it was incomplete. I now saw the other half, the one I had been taught to reject. The next vision took me to the prophets. Isaiah 53, which I had analyzed so cautiously so many times, now burned within me like an open wound. Despised and rejected of men, wounded for our transgressions. I had read that text hundreds of times, even commenting on it publicly, always trying to detach it from the image of Jesus. But there, immersed in that presence, everything was inevitable. I saw Zechariah, speaking of the one who would be pierced. I saw the Psalms crying out for liberation and describing pains that now had a face, a voice, and a presence. It was as if every verse I had memorized had been written by a hand that already knew the end of the story. I wanted to flee, to hide, to question, but he simply looked at me in silence, as someone who had always been there waiting for me to see for myself. And the shame I felt was not because I felt deceived, but because I realized how much I had resisted the truth out of fear of losing who I was. Amid all this, I felt that I was being led to two distinct places. Not physically, but in spirit. The first was a place of indescribable light. I'm not talking about the light I saw before. That one was different. It was a living, pulsating communion. There were voices, laughter, music that did not come from instruments, but from within the souls themselves. I saw people, or at least human forms, that seemed complete, whole, filled with love, as if all fear, pain, or separation had ceased to exist. And at the center of it all, I felt his presence, Jesus, not as an isolated figure, but as the source of all that. There was no fear, no formality, no doubt. There was only belonging. I do not know how long I stayed there. It could have been seconds or years. But my heart burned. I felt more myself than I had ever felt in life. And yet, a part of me knew that it was not yet the end. Then I was led to another place. And that, I do not like to remember. It was dark, not like a room without light, but as if darkness itself had substance. It was alive. It moved. It touched the skin like something viscous, cold, desperate. And there were sounds, muffled laments, echoless screams, as if the pain were constant and never relieved. But what struck me the most was the absence. Absence of peace, absence of love, absence of any divine presence. It was the absolute opposite of the previous place, and there I understood something I had never considered, that it was not punishment, it was consequence. It was the destiny of those who reject the truth when it is revealed, not out of God's cruelty, but by choice of distancing oneself. And in that moment, I felt the weight of every human decision. It was not about religion. It was not about being right or wrong. It was about accepting or refusing a love that had always been available. And that understanding crushed me. When I finally returned to my body, everything happened abruptly, almost violently. One moment I was immersed in light and absolute. Silence. The next, I opened my eyes under the cold lights of the hospital, with tubes in my nose, the smell of antiseptic, and a monitor beeping beside me. A doctor said something in Hebrew, but it sounded distant. I could only stare at the white ceiling and feel a cry trapped in my throat. A cry of relief, of confusion, of mourning for everything I thought I knew. My wife was there, her eyes swollen, holding my hand as if she did not want me to escape again. She said I had been pulseless for more than 5 minutes. 5 minutes. But to me, it was like crossing eternity. I was hospitalized for 3 days, and no one understood why I barely spoke. How to explain? How to put into words something that broke me inside only to rebuild me in a new way? Returning home was even more difficult than I imagined. My mind struggled between the man I was and the man I had become again. Every time I picked up a biblical text, it burned. The verses I knew by heart now carried another weight, another depth. It was as if I were reading between the lines for the first time. I knew I would have to tell someone. I knew that this secret could not remain hidden. But fear paralyzed me. My community trusted me. My family saw me as a pillar. And now I carried something that could shake all of that. I began by telling my wife. She listened in silence, cried, questioned. Then she just hugged me. She said she didn't understand everything, but she felt that I was speaking the truth. That gave me courage. Gradually, I shared it with my children. Their reactions varied. Silence, shock, tears. But none of them called me crazy. They knew that something in me had changed. The hardest step came afterward. It was Friday night, exactly 1 week after my heart attack. The synagogue was full, as it always is before Shabbat. I was wearing my tallit over my shoulders, the siddur in my hands, and my heart pounding. Not because of my health, but because of what I knew I had to say. When I stood up to speak, the silence was immediate. Everyone expected a traditional teaching, perhaps a reflection on life and human fragility. But what I said was something I had never imagined uttering in that place. I had an experience that changed my life, and in it, I saw the Messiah. The initial reactions were confused. Some frowned, others looked away. I continued with a trembling yet firm voice. I recounted, with the utmost respect possible, everything that had been shown to me. I did not try to convince anyone. I simply told what I had lived. I spoke of the light, of the presence, of Jesus, of the fulfillment of the scriptures, of the truth that I could no longer ignore. What followed was a silent earthquake. Some left in the middle of the account. Others stayed until the end, looking at me with teary eyes. The next day, the phone calls began. Some were of reproach, others of pain, as if I had betrayed something sacred. But I also received discreet messages from people who wanted to hear more. People who had always had doubts but had never dared to express them. My position in the community was shaken. I lost invitations. I was removed from councils. Old friends fell silent, but something within me remained steadfast, as if that presence still accompanied me. I did not feel alone, and that gave me the strength to continue. I began studying the Gospels with the same eyes I had used for years to study the Torah, and I found in them not opposition, but complementarity, bridge, a purpose, something that, instead of erasing my Jewish identity, completed it with a brilliance that had previously been missing. Since then, my life has taken an unexpected turn. I began to be sought out by people who, like me, found themselves divided between the faith they inherited and the experiences they could not explain. Some came in hiding, afraid. Others, merely curious. Sharing my story gradually became a calling. It was not easy. I suffered rejections, jokes, accusations. Some said that I was too old and that my brain had been affected by the trauma. Others accused me of having abandoned my roots. But those who truly knew me understood. I was no longer seeking answers. I had found them. And even without understanding everything, there was a certainty that no one could take from me. It was not about changing religions. It was about recognizing a truth that had always been before me, a living truth that found me at my deathbed and offered me life. Today I continue, studying the scriptures with the same passion as before, but with new eyes. I have not rejected my roots. I remain a Jew. I continue to honor my parents, my traditions, my history, but now I see the fulfillment of the promise. And although some still consider me a traitor, I feel that I have found what I always sought, the real presence of God, alive, personal, loving, revealed in Yeshua, Jesus. I do not tell this story to forcibly convert anyone, nor to cause scandal. I tell it because it is true, because it changed everything in me, and because perhaps, somewhere in the world, there is someone who needs to know that the Messiah still speaks, still appears, and still calls by name, just as he called for me.